The real Henry VIII was far worse than any history textbook would dare to tell you. He was a king so enormously fat that he required mechanical devices to move around. A man whose rotting leg wounds smelled so horrible that servants would literally flee, gagging. And a ruler whose own body was disintegrating so drastically that the gases from his decaying corpse caused his coffin to explode. If you think you know Henry VIII, the man with 6 wives who founded the Church of England, then buckle up. These startling facts about Henry VIII will alter your perception of England's most notorious monarch. His body was a walking disaster. In his strange eating habits, paranoid security measures, treatment of wives that went beyond simple execution, the horrifying reality of his last years will make Game of Thrones seem like a children's fairy tale. Let's begin with the most startling fact about Henry VIII. He was essentially a walking corpse toward the end of his life. We are discussing a man whose physique had degenerated into such a monstrous state that even his own slaves were traumatized. Henry's waist was 54 inches, which is larger than most people's heights. He weighed about 400 pounds in a time when the average man weighed maybe 140 pounds. But the worst part is that he wasn't just obese. His legs were covered in open wounds that never healed, not little cuts, but huge ulcers that constantly oozed pus and rotted flesh. According to historical accounts, the stench was so strong that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when they approached the king. In fact, servants actually drew straws to decide who would assist in dressing him because getting near those wounds was a form of punishment. Modern medical experts believe that Henry suffered a severe traumatic brain injury in a jousting accident in 1536. This was not just a bump on the head. He was unconscious for 2 hours, which in medieval terms meant he was practically dead. The injury likely caused massive personality changes, explaining his transformation from a relatively normal young king into the paranoid, angry monster of his later years. However, Henry also likely had a condition called Cushing syndrome, which would explain his dramatic weight gain, mood swings, and those horrifying leg ulcers that won't heal. His own doctors were so afraid of him that they wouldn't dare suggest the king's health. In his final years, royal attendants had to carry special chairs everywhere. Henry went because he could hardly move from room to room without getting into an accident. This is the same man who executed people for glaring at him, and 2 of his wives had it even worse than you think everyone knows. The man who claimed divine right to rule was unable to even control his own bowel movements when Henry VIII had 6 wives and put 2 of them to death, but the truth about what those women went through goes far beyond a simple beheading. We're talking about psychological torture that would make contemporary serial killers envious. For example, before Anne Boleyn was put to death, Henry set up a complex plot in which he forced her own musician to confess to having an affair with her under duress. The really horrible part is that Henry made and watched as 5 men, including her own brother, were put to death for allegedly having an affair with her. She had to stand there knowing that she was next on the death row because of her husband's paranoid fantasies. Catherine Howard's situation worsened when Henry married her. She was essentially a teenager at the time, and when he learned of her previous affairs, he passed a law that made it treasonous for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their sexual history. Imagine being so petty that you altered the entire legal system because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. But the worst part was the psychological games. Henry would lavish his wife with presents and love one day, then ignore or threaten them. While Henry spread rumors that Catherine of Aragon was mentally ill, she spent her last years essentially under house arrest and was not allowed to see her daughter Mary. She died alone, possibly poisoned, and wrote letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. This is something that will blow your mind. Henry actually made his wife sign papers consenting to their own enumerations or divorces. The fortunate one, Jane Seymour, died of natural causes after giving birth to Henry's son. Henry was already eyeing his next wife before Jane's body was even cold. So he waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to begin planning his next marriage. Anne of Cleves was so afraid of him that she consented to a fictitious marriage ceremony in order to avoid execution. She essentially had to pretend their marriage never happened and thank him for saving her life. The worst aspect was that these women had no way out of the situation, and the man treated them like trash. Divorce wasn't an option. Fleeing meant dying, and resisting meant not only your personal execution, but also the possible devastation of your entire family. 3. If you think competitive eating is crazy now, wait until you hear about Henry VII's daily food intake. This man not only ate like a king, but he also ate as if he were attempting to start a famine on his own. For comparison, Henry ate about 5,000 calories a day, which is more than twice what an active adult male should eat. Keep in mind that by the end of his life, he was barely able to walk. However, it wasn't the sheer amount that was strange. Rather, it was what he ate and how he ate it. A typical meal for Henry included a whole roasted pig, several whole chickens, various fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to float a small boat. Henry personally sampled many of the more than 800 items his kitchen staff cooked daily for his household. More than 200 workers worked around the clock in the royal kitchens to satisfy his appetite.
Oh.
But this is where things start to become really strange. Henry was certain that some foods had magical qualities. He thought that eating swan would make him more elegant. Eating a lot of deer would make him a better hunter, and eating oysters would improve his performance with his wives, as if he were. Obsessed with medieval superfoods, he would overindulge in these foods. Additionally, the man had the most peculiar dietary habits. In order to check for poison, several servants tasted every single piece of food that Henry ate. However, because he was so paranoid, he made his food tasters wait 30 minutes after eating. Before touching anything to ensure they wouldn't die from delayed-acting poison, Henry's meals were basically theatrical performances. He'd eat in front of hundreds of quarters, and the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there watching this massive rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Henry actually banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he thought they were beneath his royal status. Common people's food, like turnips and barley, were literally illegal at his table, even though they probably would have been better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed daily. The truly insane part, even as his body was literally falling apart from his diet, Henry kept eating more and more, convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his gluttony for the paranoia that ruled an empire. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just your typical trust-no-one attitude. This man turned his entire kingdom into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators. Jealous by his final years, Henry made royal life a living hell for everyone around him because he was so certain that they were all conspiring against him. First, let's discuss his sleeping arrangements. Henry had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Imagine being so afraid of being assassinated that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses. Henry also kept many daggers under his pillow and loaded crossbows next to his bed. The palace itself turned into a paranoid stronghold. Henry had secret passageways built in every building he occupied, not for romantic or practical reasons, but so he could flee if he was assailed. He also had listening devices concealed in meeting rooms to listen in on private conversations and peepholes installed in walls to spy on his own quarters. This is where things really got crazy. Court life turned into a psychological horror show where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally result in your execution. Henry's food paranoia reached completely absurd proportions. He established a whole network of spies whose job it was to spy on his other spies. He also had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could trust. In addition to having several food tasters, he insisted that his meals be prepared in completely sealed kitchens, with guards monitoring every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, and even the water had to be tested by different people. He was so certain that someone would poison him that he even suspected his own children of plotting against him, that he had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he believed they were planning to overthrow him. Henry's paranoia became so great that he began executing people for crimes they hadn't yet committed. He would have someone killed because he had a dream that they had betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. When Henry was in one of his paranoid episodes, the Tower of London was always crowded with people whose only transgression was being close to him. The most horrifying aspect is that Henry's paranoia spread so far across his court that everyone lived in constant fear of becoming the next target of the king's irrational accusations. Nobility began spying on one another, slaves betrayed their masters for fictitious prizes, and everyone else, even 5 deaths, couldn't halt the mayhem. It would seem that Henry VII's reign of terror would come to an end when he passed away. Even his death was able to generate complete chaos because this man was so dedicated to being a disaster. First, let's talk about his last weeks. Henry was so big that he was unable to walk, so his servants had to carry him everywhere in a specially made chair with wheels and pulleys. The worst part is that his leg wounds were so infected that they were literally falling off his body as they moved him. To wipe up the pieces of decaying king that fell on the palace floors, servants had to trail behind him with cloths. His final moments resembled scenes from a horror film. Even his doctors, accustomed to medieval medical horrors, had to leave the room to vomit because Henry's body had swelled to such hideous proportions that his skin was stretched tight and shiny. When he finally passed away, no one wanted to get close enough to formally confirm his death. But wait, it gets worse. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something truly amazing happened. The coffin literally exploded. The gases from Henry's decomposing body building up so much pressure that the lead lining burst open and rotting. Royal remains splattered all over the inside of the hearse. The smell was so horrible that the funeral procession had to stop while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. This detail will haunt your dreams. Henry's body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that his coffin necessitated special reinforcement. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin. But the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and rotting flesh. It took several attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed to rule by divine right ended up as dog food on a country highway. The mayhem continued for years after that, with people reporting odd sounds and foul odors emanating from Henry's grave. Some people believed it was his ghost, but historians believe it was likely just additional gases escaping from his constantly decaying remains. Henry's death was so terrible for everyone concerned that a number of the servants who handled his body passed away within weeks, presumably from infections they contracted from coming into contact with his decaying body. This is something that isn't taught in history textbooks. Not the charismatic king of popular culture. The real Henry VIII was a walking disaster, whose body betrayed him as dramatically as he betrayed everyone around him. He was so consumed by gluttony and paranoia that he turned one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe into his personal horror show. The most powerful man in England became a prisoner of his own deteriorating body, and even death couldn't stop his ability to cause complete chaos. If these unsettling royal facts caused you to reevaluate everything you believed you knew about history, click the subscribe button because there are many more terrifying facts that textbooks conveniently omit. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet. His legacy isn't just the Church of England or his 6 wives. It's a masterclass in how absolute power can turn a human being into something truly monstrous.